Okay. Okay, should we get started? Bismillah. Bismillah walhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalam ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa sahbihi wa barak wa sallam. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So where we left off last week, we had talked about the passing of Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. And we had talked about in the week before that the passing of Abu Talib and how there's two opinions whether Khadija passed and then about 40 days later Abu Talib passes, or Abu Talib passes and then 40 days later Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha passes. We talked about this in the context of what's known in the prophetic biography, the year of sorrow, the year of sadness, Am al-Huzn. And last week, we focused a lot about Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, the impact she had on the Prophet's life, the impact like we should be drawing from her as a key figure and exemplar in our lives, and how we can draw and extrapolate a lot of just meanings and lessons for things that we could be doing day to day through her existence. And so where we at now is essentially like when Am al-Huzn is beginning, right? Because the onset of a lot of this stems from the passing away of the two key figures in the Prophet's life, Abu Talib and Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha. And these two figures also incorporate gaps through their absence in certain ways. Like the Prophet has Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha as a confidant, as a supporter, and she plays a critical role in terms of the overall Muslim community, in terms of kind of being a beneficiary. She bankrupts herself during the time of the boycott when they're in the valley for a couple of years. We talked about it a few weeks ago. But Abu Talib's role in Meccan society is a little bit more concretely defined, right? Like, who is Abu Talib within the context of the Meccan society at that time? What do we know of him? Other than his relation to the Prophet, like how does he fit into the hierarchical structure of Meccan society?
He's on the top.
He's on the top. And why is he on the top?
Because he's part of one of the most coveted tribes.
Sure, right? So now he passes away. Somebody has to fill that gap in this kind of tribalistic society. The Meccan society is not structured the way New York City is structured, or kind of the way governance is structured in kind of states and locales as we understand. There's not a mayor of Mecca. There's not a governor in the ways that we understand. We have a governor of New York. And so how kind of customs and norms are solidified and kind of society functions takes under the route of a lot of customs within this tribal culture. But Abu Talib, being like the elder in the Banu Hashim, he plays a critical role because he is a son of Abdul Muttalib. So when he passes away, the next most senior individual who's in their family that is also still kind of where they're at as Qurayshis, right? Because who are the uncles of the Prophet that we know of like his aunts and uncles? There's Hamza and Abbas radiallahu anhuma, who both convert to Islam. And there is Abu Talib and Abu Lahab, who don't convert to Islam, right? We talked last week or 2 weeks ago about how there's a narration in Ibn Ishaq where as Abu Talib is going to pass away, Ibn Ishaq cites that Abbas tells the Prophet that I've heard your uncle like saying what it was that you told him to say, and Allah knows best. You know, there's different perspectives on this within the Sunni tradition. In the Shi'i tradition, they also have perspectives on this. But here, in a recognition of what we know more broadly from the lives that they have lived, this is kind of what the categorization is. They're not going to tell like Hamza radiallahu an to lead the Banu Hashim now in the Meccan society, because he converted to Islam, right? So Abu Lahab is going to step up and fill that void from a leadership standpoint. Abu Lahab does not like the Prophet teaching Islam. What do we say about Abu Lahab? Like, of the Qurayshis, or rather of the Banu Hashim and the Banu Muttalib during the boycott, everybody, Muslim and non-Muslim, are in the valley with the Prophet, except Abu Lahab. He's pretty much the only one, arguably like his sons also, but really him. He says, I'm still with you all. I'm not with these guys. He and his wife, we talked about when we were talking about persecution and the public propagation of Islam, they're very deeply antagonistic of the Prophet of God, and they are close neighbors of his. Like, it's like a really detrimental situation. He's now in charge. And in the onset, Abu Lahab actually extends more of a sense of compassion towards the Prophet. A recognition that he's now moved from being an isolated individual and takes on the responsibility of being a leader within their society, right? And you can parallel this to a lot of different people that you might have grown up with, and they show maturity because they suddenly get like a title in an organization, or, you know, they became a father or a mother, and the responsibility just brings on with it maturation in certain regards. Abu Lahab was appointed to be now the head of all of this stuff. And he extends to the Prophet ﷺ a sense of protection, saying that do what it was that you were doing. You'll be afforded the same opportunity as you were under Abu Talib. Abu Jahl is not down with this, as are not other people. And so they strategize on how it is that they can create a challenge with the Prophet of God, and Abu Lahab extending this to him. And so they tell Abu Lahab, go and ask your nephew where Abdul Muttalib is. Abdul Muttalib, the grandfather, the Prophet of God, he's dead. He's not alive anymore, right? So Abu Lahab goes and he asks his nephew, like, where is my father? And the Prophet, being one who has like a wisdom in how he responds to things, he's not just speaking in a black and white sense, where quite often when we engage in discourse with people, we're not necessarily talking to people, we're talking at them. And answers don't necessarily take into consideration like situational ethics. There's not a sense of compassion or empathy. This is just what it is. I have to be blunt with you. So when Abu Lahab comes to speak to the Prophet and asks, like, where is my father? The Prophet simply says to him, he is with his people. There's not like any need for agitation from the response. Abu Lahab then goes and he says to Abu Jahl, like, this is what he said, right? He was good with it, the answer. And Abu Jahl says to Abu Lahab that what he means by this is that your father is in hell. And we don't know if that's what the Prophet actually is conveying through his like response. But Abu Jahl says this to Abu Lahab, and Abu Lahab, now irate, says to like the Prophet of God, like, this is what you think of my father. There's no protection for you here any longer. The need for him to extend the protection is not just limited in a mode of compassion, but he has to honor the rights of leadership within that society that is rooted in this sense that as a clan, your strength is in protecting the most underserved and underprivileged members of it. And if he doesn't do right by what his people's norms and customs are, they're going to call him out on it. But now, when this comes up, there's a movement to be able to separate, albeit through an emotional experience, And the Prophet has no protection at this juncture any longer in Mecca. Within the context of Amr Huzn, he's lost his uncle and his wife, both of whom he loves very much. And you want to be able to understand how, like, the Seerah is an entire lived experience. So when we said last time that Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha bears, like, for the most part, all of the children of the Prophet of God, she's passed away now. What does this mean that the Prophet has become at the result of his wife dying? He's now a single dad, right? And if you've ever met a single father who has lost his wife and their children are not so old, right? Fatima radiallahu ta'ala anha is not an elderly woman. She's still a young child at this time. The people who are around them in this moment of Amr Huzn are in a place where they start that much more of a unique form of persecution and abuse. So rather than offering consolation or words of compassion, in the immediate, when the Prophet is walking around now, he is met with mocking and ridicule. And just think about what it is that is there in terms of the degradation, right? Like, people have no sense of dignity towards him. He just lost his uncle and his wife, is trying to cope with the sadness of it. We have narrations that tell us that there were times that he didn't really leave his house so much immediately after, because he's trying to deal with the realities of some of these losses. And not only is he not being met with a sense of compassion, but they're purposely antagonizing him in the aftermath of this. And he still has to be the messenger of God, not retorting, not refuting in any ways. Right? This is where some of these instances come up in the aftermath of this, the passing of his uncle, the passing of his wife. He is praying in public, and Abu Jahl comes and begins to choke him with a scarf around his neck. Abu Bakr radiallahu an interjects, "Aturiduna yaqtuluna rajulan yaqulu Rabbi Allah," that do you want to kill a man who all he is saying, Allah is my Lord? The instance that many of us have heard about, likely, where the Prophet is in prostration and they drop, like, the intestines of a recently sacrificed animal upon his back in front of his daughter Fatima. Like, purposely going to a place that says, you have no one looking after you anymore. We can do to you whatever it is that we want to do. The level of challenge that comes up now is one that has deep difficulty in it. And there's a sharp contrast, because Abu Talib, when these men said to him, like, give us your nephew so we can kill him, his response is he takes his whole clan and they live in a valley for 2 to 3 years in a boycott under difficult situations. He goes from one end of the spectrum to a complete opposite, that at any point in time, any of these guys can do to him whatever it is that they want. So only in these dire circumstances does the Prophet now leave from Mecca to find a different place for his people to be. We're moving now into the last stages of the Meccan part of the Seerah, and we're in the 11th year after Hijrah. The Prophet is experiencing Amr Huzn, the year of sorrow, the year of sadness. Protection was extended to him momentarily, but was taken away from Abu Lahab, and he's now in a place where he is moving forward, trying to figure out where he can take his people. When he leaves from the Meccan society, what he is basically indicating also is that I am leaving behind my clan and tribal affiliations. It's not something that's a matter of ease, but in the way their society functions, it's something that now brings upon him this sense of Like, we are letting go of whatever it is that we have here in Mecca, and we're going to go find someplace else to be. He moves forward from this place, and with Zayd ibn Haritha, who at one point was Zayd ibn Muhammad, the two of them together go first to the city of Taif. We talked about Taif like a while ago, when you can remember, for those of you who were here at that time, we're talking about like the sacrilegious wars, right? We're talking about challenges that come in Taif. They are the Banu Taqif, right? This is their clan. And Taif is where they practice idolatry and idol worshiping, but the idol that they have in their temples is the idol that's known as Allat. And when Abraha came to attack during Am al-Fil, the year of the elephant, when the Prophet was born, the people of Taif sided with Abraha in allyship. They wanted, like, Mecca to also be potentially devastated, so that their temples with Allat could be kind of the epicenter of like pilgrimage and then economy and known the way Mecca was known. And if you remember when we talked about this a year ago, right? Taif was kind of like the vacation spot of the people of Mecca. It's about 70 miles away from Mecca, and many of the people of Mecca had additional homes and land in Taif where they would go. And this is going to come up in a little bit when we talk about the aftermath of Taif. When the Prophet ﷺ, he goes with Zayd ibn Haritha, but he's not going with like Umar ibn al-Khattab or Hamza radiallahu an, who are the strongest of the strong of his companions. And when they go, Zayd ibn Haritha and the Prophet ﷺ, it's about a week and a half journey on foot, 70 miles walking from Mecca to Taif. And the first three people that they meet with are three of the chieftains of the city of Taif. They're not meeting initially with like the everyday people and trying to engage them in that level, but they're meeting first with like these three brothers who are the sons of one of the leaders of Taif. And so what I'd like for us to do, just so we can get started talking, two things that I'd like you to talk about with the person sitting next to you. Why do you think the Prophet took Zayd ibn Haritha as opposed to like Hamza or Umar when he went to these places? And why did he first talk to the leaders of Banu Taqif and not the everyday people? Because in Mecca, the first followers of Islam were the people that nobody thought had anything really to offer. They were a lot of people who were slaves or former slaves, people who didn't necessarily have like so much clout and power. Some of them did, but not all of them did. And here the Prophet is purposefully engaging like the chieftains of the tribes first. And he goes with Zayd ibn Haritha. He doesn't go with like some of these other people, and it's just the two of them. So just so we can kind of get talking for a bit, if you can turn to the persons next to you, why do we think he did these things, right? Because a lot of what we're going to talk about today is going to be rooted in understanding how the Prophet has a lot of strategy in what it is that he's doing and ensuring he's covering his bases. But go ahead. If you don't know the names of the persons next to you, exchange some names. Why do we think he chose Zayd ibn Haritha as opposed to any of the other companions? Because anybody would go with him if he told them, right? And why did he talk to the chieftains first and not like the everyday people, the lay people? Thanks, man. Okay, so what are some of the things that are coming up for people? Like, why do we think he took Zayd ibn Haritha instead of somebody else, like Alma or Hamza? And why did he go to talk to the chieftains first and not like just the common people? What do we think? Yeah.
He wasn't going there to intimidate or, like defend himself. The prophet was going there to convince. So I'm guessing Zaid was a better person with better qualities to convince than someone like Hamza.
Well, Zayd is essentially like a slave, right? And we're going to see this in a little bit because a lot of us are familiar with what happens at Taif. Some of us might not be. This is where the prophet gets stoned, do you know? And at one point, like Zayd comes in to try to break up the stoning, and the prophet says, "Move out of the way." They're like trying to get me, but not you. And they're not going to try to kill the prophet because if the people of Taif kill the prophet, they're going to have a war with them and the people of Mecca, right? This already happened when we talked about the sacrilegious wars, do you know? So there's still these tribal customs. Zayd has no protector, you know? He's like, he doesn't have anybody going for him in that sense. Do you see what I mean? Right? But speaking to this point, like, yeah, like what's he coming with? Do you know? But what else? What else did you come up with? Yeah.
Maybe it's a sign of respect that he went to the elders first. to show them that he's respecting their authority instead of like approaching people directly behind their backs.
Yeah. Other thoughts? Anything else that people came up with? Yeah.
He went at the time like with a slave to show that anyone can be part of Islam, anyone can be Muslim. It doesn't matter about your class, it doesn't matter about your status. That's why even though he could have came with Omar radiallahu anhu or one of his uncles, he decided not to show that even though I'm going to the elders, no one else needs to be intimidated to be forced into the religion. Anyone is welcome to it.
Yeah. So when we talked about the Prophet being a shepherd, we talked about the hadith, kulukum ra'in, all of you are shepherds, right? And the hadith continues, and all of you are responsible for your sheep. Like you'll be questioned about your flocks, right? May Allah make our questioning on the Day of Judgment easy. Understanding within this, like some of the things we talked about, the role of the shepherd in relation to the sheep is that a sheep, like their visibility kind of frame is very limited. You can only see what's immediately in front of you. They rely on the shepherd for foresight. Leadership in our tradition, in any capacity, is not rooted in anxiety, like I have an uncertainty of what tomorrow will bring, but I have to be able to map out scenarios that could potentially be yielded consequently from decisions. And short-sightedness is not the same as having foresight, right? So the Prophet is leaving what in Mecca? Abu Lahab has said, there's no protection for you. And he's not saying in privacy, like, hey, you know what? We won't tell anybody. But Abu Lahab does not like this to begin with. So when the Prophet leaves from Mecca, the ability to leave without any pursuit. Because what did these people do when Muslims left to go to Abyssinia? They chased them all the way to Abyssinia to try to bring them back to Abyssinia, to bring them back to Mecca. And Taif has a relationship with the city of Mecca, right? They already have, like people in Mecca own land in Taif. So if you can imagine, if like all of us all together right now walked out of this room, down the hallway, coordinated, like simultaneously, and we just left all together, right? We walked into like rooms that way and out of rooms. People would say, what is this mob of people doing? Do you know? If you think about somebody who is like well known to you, right? The Muslim community who are like figures that are well known. Do you know what I mean? If Sheikh Omar Suleiman like walked into a space and like had a crowd of people following him, it's not going to be something that doesn't catch people's eyes. It will catch people's eyes. Nobody cares what Zayd ibn Haritha is doing. And the Prophet doesn't leave on a mount or with like numerous supplies. Zayd ibn Haritha and the Prophet leave on foot from Mecca. He's not going alone, like always good as a leadership strategy, especially if you're going into unfamiliar places or you don't know who you're talking to, that you have two people that are able to kind of cover your back, right? Like people ask quite often, like what are some of the wisdoms as to why in testimony you would have two men or one man and two women in certain situations? It's not about gender inequity, but a recognition that like men can be idiots. And if you have two women together, then the one woman is able to have the back of the other woman in what quite often is unnecessarily patriarchal in many societies, right? Right? So in being able to understand now, like he's got somebody who's with him who also was so close to him that at one point he's known as Zayd ibn Muhammad. Zayd ibn Muhammad is so close to the Prophet that he gets married to Ayman Baraka, who's one of the women who we said like nursed the Prophet, right? There's somebody who's there journeying with him that he can trust. If Umar and Hamza or other people leave, or they leave in like a pack, they already know that a bunch of these people went to Abyssinia and set up a satellite space where they're safe. They don't want these guys to leave and do their own thing. They want them to suffer and they want them to die and they want Islam to die. And in the midst of losing his uncle and losing his wife and having people throw intestines of animals at him and choke him, he still has to be 3 steps ahead. What's going to happen? Do you see? When he's getting now to the chieftains of these people, like ethics in our tradition are situational. And you've already experienced in a Meccan society what you've experienced. You want to piece things that we have talked about together. The idea isn't to treat the Seerah as an opportunity to just memorize dates and memorize names and be able to answer questions on a sheet of paper that I know every child's name. Yeah, there's benefit to these things, but think about what you already know and how it informs things. Other than Abyssinia, what happens, right? Group of Christian Arabs come from the north and they sit with the Prophet and they convert to Islam. Do you remember when we talked about this? Do we think the people of Taif don't know what's happening in Mecca right now for the last 11 years? Right? And how it's turning their society upside down, boycotts, families fighting with each other, people migrating to other countries. If the Prophet comes and he starts engaging people, he will likely convince some of them to convert to Islam. So he's got to give a heads up to the people who are in charge, like, hey, I'm here in this space, not allowing for there to be anything that undermines what he's hoping to do. It's strategic. He needs to be a few steps ahead. This is an important part of prophetic character and like a sunnah that you want to adopt. Do you know? Because think about it, right? Like if we went around the room right now, and not because of iniquitous practice or like a tough job market, but the number of people that we sit with, and it's purposeful. You might not think it's purposeful, but it's purposeful. That when you go to school in this country, they're not teaching you things that actually have to deal with life skills for the most part. You learn all kinds of random stuff that you don't remember. Do you remember half of the things you learned when you were in 7th grade or 8th grade or 10th grade or whatever else? No, right? Artists' names and explorers' names and all different kinds, unless it's relevant to what you do now. Nobody teaches you, for example, how to save money, right? They don't want people like us to save money. They create consumer-driven apparatus like rent-a-centers and low-income neighborhoods so somebody can have the facade of having like materialistic things and rent a couch for a week or rent a hot tub for a week or rent a giant TV for a week, feeding the nafs, but also imposing like more self-deprecation on a person that you're only good if you could pretend to have these types of things. And then there's no foresight. I'm always in a place where I just seem to not ever save. I don't even know where to begin to save, right? And in our tradition, you can save, right? Khidr and Musa, peace be upon them both, when they're together, and one of the places they go is to rebuild the wall in a town where townspeople are mistreating them. And Khidr alayhi salam has been questioning Moses for a while, and he says at this juncture, not questioning, but like, if you're going to rebuild the wall, why don't you at least charge them, the people who are mistreating us? And Khidr says, this is where we part ways. And what he finds out in that instance is that at the base of the wall is like wealth that's been buried by righteous people for their children, which means like these righteous people who, because of their righteousness, like what we're taught is that children benefit from the good deeds of their parents. Right? Sayyid ibn Musayyib, rahimahullah, he would tell his children, I do good things so you will benefit. And these righteous good people who are so good that Allah sends Khidr and Moses to protect the wealth of their children, they saved money for their kids. Right? It's not a stretch, like that's what they did. But in every aspect of what we do, it's very short-sighted. I can only think in the immediate, and emotions in the immediate define. It's too hard for me to make difficult decisions. The Prophet thought out what was happening and what were possible conclusion points to this. So when he goes to speak to these three brothers, one of them is married to a woman from Mecca. So there's that connection point that's there, right? Perhaps there'll be some sense of care and compassion. All three of them shut him down, one after the next, after the next, after the next. He spends a substantial amount of time in Ta'if. It's not just a little bit of time, but a substantial amount of time, right? It's not just a day, but there's a lot that's going on there. I want you to look up a hadith. Let's see, what can we Google? If you Google hadith on mercy, and then the word Ta'if, T-A-I-F, hadith on mercy, Ta'if.
The one from Aisha?
Yeah, the first one that's going to pop up is going to be from Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha. Can somebody read this for us? Go ahead.
Aisha reported she asked the Prophet, peace be upon him, have you encountered a harder day than the battle of Uhud? The Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, said, I have met your people as they are, and the worst of it was the day of Aqaba, as I had an audience with Ibn Abi Yalil ibn Abd Khulad. He did not respond as I had hoped, so I departed with grief upon my face. I could not recover until I reached Qarn al-Ghalib. Then I raised my head to behold a cloud shading me. I looked again to behold the angel Jibreel within it, calling out to me, Verily Allah has heard what your people said to you. And their response, He has sent the angel of the mountains for you to command as you wish regarding them. The angel of the mountains called out to greet me with peace, and then he said, O Muhammad, speak as you wish. I will crush them under 2 mountains, if that is your desire. I said, no. Rather, I hope Allah will bring out from their progeny those who would worship Allah alone without associating any partners with Him.
Great. So this is like the hadith is going to set for us a sense of what transpires now from the rest of all of this. The Prophet ﷺ is in Ta'if. The chieftains have told him, like, no. So what he asks them, the sons of the leaders of the sons of the leader of Banu Thaqif, he says to them, like, please just keep it between us. Meaning, don't let the people of Mecca know that we had this conversation. He's already left Mecca without causing an uproar. And he's in a place where he's trying to find some place for his people to go. He's hopeful that Ta'if is going to be this place, but is dealing with the recognition that that might not necessarily be the case. Filling in the gaps here now, when the Prophet ﷺ is here, he now starts to talk to some of the people who are like everyday individuals, like people who are lay people. And he's more or less engaged in this process now in Ta'if for the entirety of a week. The Prophet ﷺ has not necessarily a lot of success. And you want to understand, like, we become limited in some of these things because still in the Meccan part of the Seerah, and Zayd ibn Haritha is with the Prophet of God, but Zayd ibn Haritha also passes away 8 years into the Medinese period of, like, the Seerah, right? He dies in the 8th year after Hijrah. So he's not around so much to be able to say, this is all the stuff that I saw going on in Ta'if. When the Prophet is engaging people now in Ta'if and having conversations, he's not necessarily met so much with the immediacy of responses that he got in Mecca like a decade plus earlier from the likes of Khadija radiallahu ta'ala anha, Ali radiallahu an, Abu Bakr radiallahu an. Like some of these people were just, you said it, we're good with it. One person starts to show some interest. And when this happens, the people who run the city, they now get together groups of people to commission them to harass, be hostile, and assault the messenger of God. This is important to understand for a few reasons, because sometimes when we think of Taif, we think about it as like a moment, a day. And you can't forget all of the things that we've discussed. How old is the Prophet when all of this is happening? He's 50 plus years of age. He just lost his uncle and his wife and is in a place where he walked 10 days with Zayd ibn Haritha on foot, has been rejected by the chieftains of these tribes, and is now spending still a long period of time engaged in this. This person comes with some interest, and immediately the elite come together and rally people against them. What we're taught through some of these traditions is that the Prophet is in such a daze as a result of it. Like they lined up as he is kind of being pushed out of the city, and in 2 rows, they're just throwing stones and rocks at him. And you can imagine if we lined up in like 2 rows, right? He goes the distance of many miles. Like he doesn't realize where he lands until he gets to a place called Qarn al-Manazil. That's not right next to the boundary of Taif. It's some miles away. But anticipate like if at the edge of this table, on 2 ends are where these rows are lined up. And then as the people throw their rocks, stoning the Prophet, like purposely trying to hit him in his feet, but they're also trying not to kill him. Do you know? So it's just causing misery and suffering, but they can't kill him at the risk of there being war between these 2 cities. You threw a rock, then you'd go get another rock, and then they'd get to the end of the line. And the line kept extending itself as the Prophet is walking for miles, getting to where he finally has some rest. And in this hadith that we just read, that you want to spend some time with, the first thing that Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, she says, have you encountered a harder day than the Battle of Uhud? Aisha doesn't know or experience like the Meccan Seerah, right? She's not in the picture yet. So she knows that Uhud is where they lose people like Hamza radiallahu an, and Musab ibn Umair radiallahu an, and so many of the shuhada. And the Prophet is like physically injured. There is blood coming from his face. And he says, I have met your people as they are, and the worst of it was the day of Aqaba. Taif is what he is referring to. He doesn't say, Ya Aisha, like, we don't say there's hard things in our life. He doesn't say, like, we don't question anything. She said, when was it tough? And he said, this was the toughest day. At the very onset of our engagement of the Seerah, we talked about how what is happening here, like, is Allah's plan of preparation. And of the many things we can draw from this, who is the most beloved of creation to Allah according to our religion? Huh? The Prophet, right? Why is Allah putting the Prophet through this difficulty if he loves him? How do we reconcile this? So what I'd like for you to do is turn to the persons next to you and talk this out. It's very relevant, Like we get to our wits' end sometimes when life is stressful, asking about this question of why. And the most beloved of God's creation is going through a difficulty that's unimaginable. The only person he has with him is Zayd ibn Haritha, who he has to, in the midst of that, still protect. Get out of the way, like they're going to stone you differently. If they kill Zayd, nobody's going to care. And having the wherewithal to still be mindful enough to tell him, like, you need to move out of the way. It's remarkable that he's able to do this. Why does Allah bring us to difficulty? And why do our minds automatically go to places of punishment, tribulation, God must hate me? The most beloved of God's creation is getting pelted with stones and rocks pretty much all alone in like such a way that literally like what he wears on his feet become hardened to his feet because of blood that's coming out. They're throwing like and targeting this, right? So how do we start to think about this like critically, the relationship between the way Allah loves this man, but he's still going through hardship? Does the question make sense? So we can talk about it a little bit with the persons next to us, and then we'll come back and discuss. But go ahead.
Which is unfortunate. I'm trying to work on yeah.
So
Why not? We were looking forward to it. We've been talking about in the chat for like.
I don't know. I think we will do it,
We will?
but I'm not sure.
Okay. Yeah, we were looking forward
We
to
just
it.
don't have a bus. Like all the buses are booked. And then I asked these guys also like what's the capacity, and they've invited 3 other schools to come, so it's much more limited. Yeah, but you respond to her and say like, no, we still might go. Yeah, because I don't want her to think. But I told her that because she was trying to buy airplane tickets in relation to it, and I said you shouldn't buy them in relation to that because I'm not sure what's going to happen. You know? Okay. But you can tell her we're going to do it. Okay, so let's come back. We're going to spend like next week also a little bit on this incident of Taif, you know, filling in some of the gaps in this hadith. There's some really important things we can look at. The Prophet, when he like makes this beautiful dua at Taif, if you read it between next week and this week, this week and next week, just you familiarize yourself with it a bit. It's a really beautiful dua that's found in the Seerah literature. And we're going to talk about Iraqi Christian that the Prophet meets when he's like taking a breather now, when he reaches Qanun Manazil, and you know, when he has this interaction with the angel Jibreel and the angel of the mountains, will crush these people. This man, Adas, that is the servant of Utbah and Sheba ibn Rabia, who are from Mecca, and they're vacationing essentially at their place in Taif, and they see the Prophet all bloodied and abused, and they feel bad for him, so they send their servant to give him water and grapes and things. And the Prophet begins with Bismillah, and this Christian man is the only Christian in this entire area, and he's like, how do you know this word? Like, nobody here says this, right? And kind of talking about some of that. But this is like a very important thing because it creates for a lot of us like dissonance and sometimes a crisis of faith, or when people are talking to us, we give them platitudes, you know, when they're struggling, life is hard. Put your faith in God, have more trust in God, but in a way that's not substantively said or with compassion, more as a way to justify my own passivity in relation to like your struggle. So we know that in our religion, the Prophet Muhammad alayhi salam is considered to be like Habib Allah. He's the beloved of God. And we know that he is telling his wife that day was like the toughest day. And the difficulty of it is not just about, I left Mecca, like these people like were mean to me. They're stoning him and pelting him and abusing him. And he's pretty much going through it all by himself. How do we understand this within this parameter of Allah's love for the Prophet and allowing for his beloved to go through difficulty? What did we talk about? Like, what did we discuss? Yeah.
So right before your halakha, we talked about this in the earlier one.
Crazy, really? What?
So that was like buzzing in my head. The analogy was that like when you're in a dark forest and you see like a captive light, you'll like gravitate towards it. Like of course, like how can you miss it? And the metaphor was that the darkness is like the cloudy that you're going through, and then the cabin that's lit up is like God, and you become closer to God. Is essentially kind of what we talked about. So sometimes God tests the ones that He loves because He wants to bring them closer to you, closer to Him. So that's kind of what I thought about.
Good. What else? Because that's what we'll say, right? And we want to hold that thought. God like tests those that he loves to bring them closer to him. What are you going to say?
Yeah, I was going to say that it was a very difficult question to ask because I've heard the story before, and it's always like, I've heard it in a way that if I'm going through hardship, Rasulullah, he's basically he's been the worst, and so that's supposed to help me. But the idea that he's the most beloved, and he's already in a state of mind where he has a reliance on Allah, I think that will put him in such a state of desperation after losing everyone that he's lost, that the only person to turn to, or the only one to turn to, would be Allah. Like it really drives that point because it brings him that low. So that's what I'm trying to say for me.
Can the conclusion point be that difficulty means God hates you? Can we draw that from this incident? That because there's a challenge, that means Allah dislikes you. Our theology is not rooted in a prosperity doctrine, right? This is a theology that assumes that God's favor upon you and love for you is rooted in like how much of the material you're given and whatever else. It's a racist doctrine, right? And we've spoken about it briefly in different settings before, but you can imagine like in a kind of anti-black society where white people who are wealthy and privileged can say to black people who are not that, well, we have all this stuff because God wanted us to have it, and that means he loves us and he doesn't love you. Do you know? Our prophet like slept on straw mats that when his companions saw his back covered with scars and like marks, they would be brought to tears. You know, the kings of Rome and Persia have such opulence, and this is what you have. And the prophet says, like, let them have this world. Like, we're living for, like, the next. Do you see? But when you reflect on this, it creates the opportunity that even if I don't know why I'm going through what I'm going through, I want to be able to understand for myself why my assumption is difficulty equates purely to punishment. Deprivation means, and denial means, that I must be doing something wrong. And it's just not fundamentally there. How can we say that difficulty equates to God's anger when the most beloved of God's creation is going through difficulty in Taif? We can't, right? Quite often, sometimes what we have to say to people is just, I don't know. I don't know why there's famine. I don't know why there's drought. I don't know why there's conflict. I don't know why there's more refugees than there's ever been. But if I take my reflection on knowing who God is to make sense of my world, rather than taking my experiences of the world to then determine who God is, my perspective is going to be drastically different. The prophet has spent 11 years as a prophet. He started in a place where he didn't know what it was. The angel comes, and now the angel is coming in a cloud with another angel. This is how this hadith ends. And the prophet's not shook by it. He's already had like these interactions. And that faith, that conviction, plays a key role in his ability to keep walking. Can you imagine this scene? Like, think about a population that's trying to bring you down. 50-year-old man who has just lost his uncle and his wife, who he loves more than anything. Cast out by his own people aside, his own uncle, Abu Lahab, says, I'm not going to do anything for you after this. Walks 10 days on foot, 70 miles from Mecca to Taif, which is not like a 60-degree like weather walk. And still has the strength to endure every stone that hits him, have the presence to tell his companion, get out the way so you don't get hurt. And only at the end of it does he sit down and take a rest. And you know what's crazy? When Adas comes with the grapes and he eats the grapes, he asks him, what's your name? He still has adab. He still has good character and akhlaq in the midst of all of this. And he says, Bismillah. And we'll talk about this more next week, and we'll look at the dua that highlights like the feelings of the Prophet. It's a beautiful dua where he's basically saying to Allah, like, if you have forsaken me, like that's one thing. But if this is not indicative of anything problematic, like your displeasure in me, then I'm good with whatever you've decreed. And as the duas are being made, like you have him in the confines of this home, he doesn't know that it belongs to Utbah and Shayba ibn Rabi'ah, right? And that the servant's going to come with the water and the grapes. And he still utters Bismillah, and that utterance of Bismillah becomes the mechanism through which like this Iraqi Christian man converts to Islam. They try to get him at Badr to fight against the Prophet. And he says, there's no way, like, I'm going to fight against this man. That's like fighting against, like, what do you even think you're fighting against? Right? Because he asks Adas, like, where are you from? And he says, like, I'm from Nineveh, which is, you know, the place of Yunus alayhi salam. And so the Prophet alludes to this, and he says, oh, you're from the town of Jonah. And he says, how do you know Jonah? Like, none of these people know Jonah, because Yunus alayhi salam has nothing to do with Arabian religion or anything, right? It's like a totally different thing. And he starts to like, he says, he's my brother and I'm his brother. We're prophets, etc. Do you see what I mean? Well, we'll talk about those things next week. Sometimes we can't also make sense of the difficulty as we're experiencing it. Yaqub alayhi salam, his son Yusuf alayhi salam is thrown into the well, correct? The Quran indicates Yaqub alayhi salam is so distraught, he nearly cries himself blind as a result of this. Yaqub alayhi salam's tears are a necessary variable for Yusuf alayhi salam to get to his end destination and rebuild the entire economy of Egypt, consequently. That can't happen unless that separation takes place and all of those movements transpire, and the prophet Jacob has to cry in order for that to happen. You see? Sometimes we just don't know. Sometimes we're not supposed to know. But just as a key takeaway, you don't want to equate difficulty to an absence of love. The Prophet is the most beloved of God, and he's going through difficulty after difficulty after difficulty. And Allah clearly loves the Prophet of God. You see what I mean? Okay. We take 2 minutes and just turn to the persons next to us. What are we taking away from today's conversation? Next week, Like, we'll go through the dua that the Prophet makes at Ta'if. That's really beautiful. That adds more to this. Talk a little bit more about some other stuff that happens at Ta'if. On his way back from like Ta'if to Mecca, he also stops to pray tahajjud. And while he's praying tahajjud, the group of jinn come to the Prophet and they end up converting to Islam, right? And so we'll talk about some of these different things. But let's talk for 2 minutes, like, what are we taking away from some of this? And then we'll discuss, and then we'll pray Isha. But go ahead. I know, it's so sad. You saw what poster? Oh, you wanna know a secret? I'm not gonna be there. They just put my face on it. Isn't that crazy? Yeah. And then they left flyers here. Like, yeah. Guys, we're gonna pray Isha in 2 minutes. Huh? No, I got nothing. That's like the ultimate disrespect. Like, we come into your house and plaster things that you told us you're not coming to. What can I do? Okay, what are some of the things we're taking away from today? Maybe we can get a few people and then we'll call the adhan. What do we think? Yeah.
Very deep. I don't know how to say, but I would say I think everything is a text. In these days, we interpret this kind of difficulty so easily that, oh, if I'm beloved or if I'm the person of this faith, why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala giving me this struggle? Or it's so easy to think that way. But I think the other way is like our difficulties may not be as much as suffering or difficulties from the other person that we don't know. This may be nothing compared to something else, somebody else. So I think it's the test of resilience and also a test of our iman And the last thing, the beautiful thing that you say, that we should never define the difficulties in absence of love. Like love is always there, so we should not question that. Rather, take it as a test and to resolve it on our own or with the community or the people. But definitely, it's a test of resilience and the deep. How can I say? To relate to in a much deeper level of the faith. And the thing you mentioned that um, like through his journey, that suffering, like doing the right thing, like people of the faith may not have been accepted that way, but if I look into this world now, like even in our own Muslim world, like no, who we pick to do the right thing, like are we doing it? So I think there is a much bigger learning and takeaway from this tonight's class. It's very important that you
Yeah, and it's hard, right? And you want to be kind to yourself. You know, we do an Umrah trip every year. We're going this year, January 2nd to the 11th. You guys should come. I'm leading that one. Sheikh Fiaz is going to lead one in February over President's Day. And seats are limited, so you should definitely try to sign up soon if you want to go. We went like years ago, the first time we were going to go. I had flown to Toronto a couple of days before we were going to depart. And when I was in Toronto, I ate some bad sushi. And when I came back to New York, I got terrible food poisoning. And aside from like the excessive amount of vomiting, my body temperature was so high, they wouldn't allow me on the plane. And in my head, I am miserable. Like I love going to Medina, especially, right? I named my daughter Medina. You know, like I love Medina. It's one of the most beautiful, like tranquil places I've ever been in my life. And all kinds of thoughts are running through my head in this illness as I'm laying in my bed in my apartment. Like Allah must be punishing me. Only like the special invited guests of Allah are brought to, you know, Medina and Mecca. And everything was equating to punishment in my head. And I called one of my friends and I said, I'm really sick. And like the trip I organized, everybody just flew out for it. And I'm here, not on the trip. And then my friend said to me, oh, that's so good. Allah is purifying you through this, right? And I was like, we're so dumb, man. What do you mean? I'm like throwing up all over the place. What are you talking about? And then that night, my brother came to pick me up and he drove me to my parents' home in New Jersey. This is maybe like 16 years ago. And I hadn't really spent so much time after I started working here, like extended with my family. And because I was supposed to be overseas, there's nothing on my calendar. And I rested up, got to be in my parents' house, like sleep with my head in my mother's lap, eating her home cooked food. And every day my temperature went down a little bit. And then I flew, met the group in Medina with like 10 hours left in Medina. And 10 hours in Medina is 10 hours in Medina. They had lost my luggage on the plane. But I would never want to not have those days I spent with my parents. And then it just felt a little different. Experientially, I went through 3 different phases. An initial frame of punishment. Somebody told me that this was like an expiation of things. And at the end, I found benefit in it. The outcome, I simply don't know why Allah does what Allah does. But Allah is Al-Hakim. He is the source of wisdom, not me. Allah is Al-Alim, the source of all knowledge, not me. And I can find contentment in the fact that it's not my responsibility to know. But I, as best as I can live with the understanding that the prophetic recommendation is rooted in hadith that tell us things like the affair of the believer is unique. When misfortune befalls, they patiently persevere, and there's good in that. And when something beneficial happens, they praise the divine, and there's good in that. You don't want to be hard on yourself, especially when hardship surrounds you. It's not the time to make sense of something. You don't tell the drowning person as they drown, how does it feel to drown? And when somebody comes to you with difficulty, sometimes just listen and hold what they're holding and don't answer questions, right? That just also make it hard for people to know who Allah is. If you have only like ease and comfort and no challenge in your life, that might be a source of just trying to figure out, like, why is Shaitan not bothering me? Do you know? Like, why? Why is he not riling me up? It's not necessarily meant to be an absence of anxiety that there's nothing, like this world is not supposed to be Jannah. The next world is supposed to be Jannah, right? May Allah make us all people of Jannah. And the Prophet is the inwardly most stable human being. And he's telling his wife, this was the hardest day of my life. Like, it's tough. It's okay to say that things can be tough and things can be difficult. This is not an absence of faith. If anything, it's a more sound understanding of what real Iman is. I just need to rely on God when I choose my reliance of things. You see what I mean? Okay, let's take a pause here. I don't know what else is happening the rest of this week. We have a bunch of events that are going to be taking place. Oh, on Friday night, we're doing a talk here with Faridun Mujaddidi, who's from California. He's really brilliant on a lot of topics, but a lot of his work revolves around like Rumi and the works of Rumi. So he's going to be doing a session here on Rumi on Friday night at 6 o'clock. So definitely try to come to that. And we're trying to like put together some other events that'll be happening in the next couple of weeks that are more planned last minute. Like we might do something with Taco Fall, who's a basketball player. Do you guys know him? He's a really tall basketball player. People know what I'm talking about. You don't know. Plays in the G League. He's 7'9". He's Muslim. He wrote a children's book recently, and some other things that are coming up, some conferences and stuff that we'll share information on. 7'6". I mean, yeah. So if you want to see me standing next to a 7'6" person, right, be ready for it, because it's crazy. In Ramadan, these two guys who play Division I basketball, they were here in Madison Square Garden. They were playing in the NCAA, March Madness tournament, and they came and played Tarawih with us. And they were like, let's take a picture together. One of them I've known since he was a little kid. He's grown up in our community. It's amazing to see, like, mashallah, he's growing into an amazing young man. But they also, like, if I stood on my own shoulders, I still wouldn't have been as tall as them. I look like I was their grandson coming up to their knees. Yeah, we'll send out more information on those things. Try to come to as much as you can. The world is still like a very heavy place. May Allah make it easy. And even as we've become somewhat desensitized to certain things, it's indicative every day that a lot of the way things function are fundamentally antithetical to a lot of what our tradition tells us to believe in. And even if you're doing okay, when you're here, you might have someone who shows up that's not doing so well. And they just need good people like you to be able to lean on and sit with and kind of restabilize. So come to these things so people come and they can be with people like yourselves. Inshallah, we're here for one another during these times. So people want to just move their chairs over to the wall. Somebody can call the adhan for Isha, and we'll pray Isha.